Sam Lewis is the Deputy Criminal Chief of the Program Fraud Division, Department of Justice. He joined the Department of Justice as an Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of Texas in Houston in 1992. He oversees prosecutors and prosecutions of healthcare fraud, bankruptcy fraud, fraud committed against federal programs, and fraud involving the manufacture, importation, exportation, and distribution of counterfeit medicines. Mr. Lewis.
This packet contains test material, so I'll talk with you about that afterwards now. I want to talk about counterfeit pharmaceuticals and kind of give you an idea of how we're here today and where we were in 2005. Can I get a show of hands of those of you who were involved in investigating counterfeit pharmaceuticals back in 2005? Wow. And that kind of tells you what's transpired since 2005. And I'll give you an idea of how I became involved in that. As an assistant U.S. attorney, I was involved in prosecuting healthcare fraud, and I received a call from an agent, an FDA agent, who was involved in investigating a VA tech who was stealing pharmaceuticals and selling it to a pharmacist outside the VA system. And he indicated that an HSI agent had come across an individual who was selling counterfeit pharmaceuticals over the internet. And I stopped him and said, Doug, what does that have to do with healthcare fraud? I prosecute individuals who steal from the Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance. Has nothing to do with healthcare fraud. And he said, just be patient. Let's sit down and meet and talk about it. So we had a meeting, and they told me about an individual who was in Shelton, Washington, who was selling counterfeit pharmaceuticals over the internet. And as they were talking to me about what he was doing, I kept asking questions. The guy's in Shelton, Washington. I'm in Houston, Texas. What does it have to do with me? I said, just be patient. The guy is receiving counterfeit pharmaceuticals, lifestyle drugs, Viagra and Cialis, and the drugs are coming from China. And we want you to be involved in the prosecution of this individual. And I said, doesn't look like there's anything I would be interested in. And the HSI agent said, well, listen, this is a priority case with my office. And at that time, HSI was not HSI, it was ICE. And we think that the Chinese government may be interested in allowing us to do an undercover. And we think that as a result of you being involved in the prosecution, there would be some international travel. So I just sat back in my chair. I said, thank you for the information. And afterwards, I called the FDA agent and said, because of this last bit of information, I don't think I'm going to take. You know that prosecutors don't travel internationally. Why would he say that? But I ended up taking the case anyway. And my first order of business was to call the U.S. Attorney's Office in Shelton, Washington, and first of all, see if they were interested in the case. And the response I got is similar to the response that you all may have gotten in 2006 and 2007 if you contacted a U.S. Attorney's Office about prosecuting someone involved in counterfeit pharmaceuticals. The response from a supervisor at AUSA at the time was, why are you doing the bidding of the pharmaceutical industry? They got plenty of money. They don't need us to help them. And so I said, just tell me, are you interested or not? He said, no, and I think you're wasting your time. I think you're wasting the government's time doing this. Well, we proceeded on anyway. And at that time, the agents went on to make undercover purchases. And how did the agents first get involved in looking at that? They got involved because of the efforts of industry. Pfizer and Lilly at that time saw that there was going to be a problem. So I must commend those of you in the room who were involved in this early on and saw a need to make sure that there was some way to bring this to the attention of law enforcement. It wasn't that industry hid and said, even if it's a problem, we're not going to let the public know because we might be concerned with market share. No. Industry banded together, did some initial buys over the internet, monitored internet, and saw that this guy, Mr. Richard Cowley, was selling what they believed to be counterfeit drugs. So they made some test purchases, and they provided this information to the FDA and ICE agents, who in turn decided they were going to do their own undercover purchases, what they did. And then the lab for FDA did their own testing. Industry did testing. Both confirmed what they believed to be true, that Mr. Cowley was trafficking in counterfeit drugs. At that time, the drugs were Lifestyle, Viagra, and Cialis. And we did enough purchases to see the volume in which this gentleman was making sales. He was also involved in selling certain types of compounded drugs to individuals in India. So what happened? First thing I had to do was figure out, what am I going to charge? Because I had no idea what this was. So the FDA agent told me about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And now I love that statute. Back then I was like, what is this combination of stuff? I can't figure out what this is. The doing of any act causes it to be misbranded. What the heck does that mean? Well, now I love it because it's so broad that it allows you to prosecute just about any act that causes a drug to be misbranded. So it took me a while to get up to speed to reviewing what that is. Let me move forward. Let's see which one. I'm going to skip these slides because you all know why enforcement matters. So Richard Cowley case, looking at the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act statute, he was selling counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Those drugs ended up being misbranded. Let me get to this. So Cowley, the agents did the investigation. It was trademark infringement, counterfeit medicines through the internet. Industry cooperation was very important, and as I talk about the cooperation between the U.S. and Chinese authorities were key. Also, links to internet business. Someone said B2B sites was something that just occurred. No, B2B sites has been around a long time. This case, we also noticed, had some connection with B2B sites. But there were undercover meetings with Mr. Cowley. He was in Shelton, Washington. His website was Best Online Viagra, so that was a good name, and New Form Net. And how did they go about doing the investigation? They did the online purchases. They tried to identify the assets for the illegal sales and to identify distribution methods. We were trying to figure out, what is this all about? Eventually, Mr. Cowley was indicted, and he was charged with selling of misbranded drugs through the internet under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. At that time, I had no idea that there was a statute that prohibited trademark infringement. So Mr. Cowley was indicted for this crime. His sentence was 5 months. And at the time, 5 months was not a lot of time, but the reason why the sentence was so low is because in trying to figure out what the loss is for, if any of you had to deal with sending information to AUSAs to try to determine what your loss is, the sales that we could identify were only sales to law enforcement. So those sales really don't count in certain circles. So the sentence was 5 months. That was a learning experience. Fast forward, the group of agents I worked with received additional information from industry, and we decided to form a task force. Now, this is a copy of the indictment. This slide, and I'll go forward, I end up traveling to where? To China. At some point in time, there was a meeting here in Washington, D.C., and at this meeting was attachés from ICE, from Beijing, from London, from UK, and from Asia, all in connection with this case. And what was interesting was the Chinese authorities were receptive to taking some action against individuals who were involved in manufacturing and distributing these pills to the U.S. So the timing was really good. And I indicted Mr. Cowley in the U.S. in August of 2005. I traveled with 3 agents, 2 ICE agents and 1 FDA agent to China. There was raids on 4 or 5 factories, and this is a picture of the pills that were obtained during the raid. We obtained a heat seal machine, and at that time, I think there were 11 individuals who were arrested. So here was a situation, the first time I was ever involved in it, and I ended up going to China. So I'm like, can't get any worse than this. So we end up proceeding on. The next case involved an individual who was actually extradited. That is Cali. Now going back to this slide, and we all have heard about it, we've all talked about it. When the public sees a legitimate prescription or drug, there is absolutely no way they can tell. Pharmacists will tell me they can't even tell what the legitimate drug is. So how is it consumers are going to be able to do that? Randy Gonzalez. Randy Gonzalez was the first individual ever extradited to the United States for a IPR violation. And how did we end up being able to do that? There is a lot of coordination involved. And what I'll say is that for you in the room who have not built relationships with law enforcement, it's relationships that gets the job done. It really is. The global security for Pfizer, Lilly, Merck, I know that they have had good communications with the agencies that have worked in the Southern District of Texas. Randy Gonzalez was a person from Thailand who was living in China. He exported about 60,000 counterfeit Viagra and 15,000 Cialis pills in secreted cargo containers. Those cargo containers initially came to Houston, Texas, and he had 2 individuals who were distributing the drugs, Fayez Aladou and Mohammed Gwazmi, and both of those were citizens of Jordan. And these were sold to undercover agents, and they were also sold to the public. The international issues, and the reason why I brought this stack, because we were supposed to talk about bringing individuals to justice. This is the paperwork that is required in order to go through the different mechanisms to have someone extradited from another country into the United States. Mr. Gonzalez was a Thailand citizen living in China. We did online purchases from him. And those drugs, the Viagra and Cialis, ended up in warehouses like this, stored at improper temperatures. But once we made the online purchases, we actually were able to do, can you hear me on this side, if I'm not to the mic? We used search warrants to obtain information on the email communications, so we could see not only who he was communicating with law enforcement, but others as well. And so learning from my past experience with the statutes, I learned a little bit about the statute dealing with trademark infringement from my friends over at Computer Crimes Intellectual Property Rights section. Partnered with them, we learned more information about Mr. Gonzalez, and we decided we were actually going to not only prosecute the ones in the US, but we're going to reach outside the borders and prosecute and bring someone outside the country here. Because I think it's important for us, if we can, to try to dismantle the entire network. So we spent a lot of time and resources making sure that we covered all the hoops. So we had to figure out, first of all, how are we going to prosecute this guy? He's in China. We don't have a treaty with China. So we had to work to get approval to set up a meeting with him in Bangkok, Thailand. That took some coordination, took a lot of effort, and we were successful in doing so. And through the Office of International Affairs and their assistance, through a DOJ attaché in Thailand, we were successful in doing that. And I can tell you, we are making inroads, because in latter cases, when we would seize, would do search warrant for email accounts, we could see where individuals say, look, if you are dealing with somebody in Houston, Texas, we're not going to send our drugs there. So the Southern District of Texas is pretty large, so we just changed. We may say we're in Brenham, Texas, still Texas, but they don't know. So they feel more comfortable now sending us counterfeit drugs. I'm going to depart for just a second and talk about diversion, because I think that was something that you talked about earlier, and I want to talk about that. If you have a diversion case, most U.S. attorneys' offices are not really excited about prosecuting diversion cases. Am I wrong? If you are interested in getting a diversion case prosecuted, a prosecutor thinks from this standpoint: we're looking at fraud, waste, and abuse. So a counterfeit case is what? One that establishes there is a fraud. The public is harmed. They're getting something that is harmful to them. A diversion case doesn't neatly fit in fraud, waste, and abuse. So if you have a diversion case, which you now know it's setting in a warehouse somewhere, especially if you're talking with, if someone is you have a Canadian pharmacy who's sending drugs to the U.S., or you have drugs that have been stolen, say it's stolen from a truck, let me take that example, and it's been sitting in a warehouse somewhere, is degrading, that does pose a harm to the consumer. It does. So you have to have, when you pitch those cases, and this is all about marketing those cases to the agencies, you have to do it in that fashion. You have to show that there is a harm to the public, because we have competing priorities. We have so many cases that we have to deal with, and we're only going to deal with one that seems to have the biggest bang for a buck. Counterfeit pharmaceuticals, that storyline sounds great when you're presenting it to a jury. Diversion of drugs, that sounds like something that, industry can deal with, because they can control somehow drugs that's being diverted. So just diversion for that. This is a picture of the counterfeit medicines that were seized from a warehouse that Randy Gonzalez sent to the U.S. And the sentence were 21 months for Mr. Aladu, Mr. Guazme, and same thing for Mr. Gonzalez. So we move forward, and we've been dealing with lifestyle drugs. In my office, I was known as the ED guy. So in addition to doing serious cases, they said, oh, you got another ED case, do you? And for me, it wasn't a problem, because as a result of these cases, I began to understand what's going on in the marketplace and how important it was to prosecute these cases. And I can tell you, and I know it's being recorded, there was some resistance even in my own office. Are you handling this case over here? Well, you've got this $20 million healthcare fraud case, and you're doing with this Viagra case. We want to make sure that your priorities are straight. I said, I can do both of them, don't worry about it. Well, when the agents were in Thailand to pick up Mr. Gonzalez, after we had gone through all the approval process, after he traveled to Thailand, after he was arrested, after he had his hearings, and after we finally got approval to extradite him, while they were there, they received some information about a guy by the name of Kevin Xu, a Chinese businessman who was supplying generic drugs to the Chinese government, who was someone who had a large operation. And they actually met Mr. Xu there in Bangkok. At the same time, they were picking up Mr. Gonzalez. So I must tell you that I have been the benefit of law enforcement. These guys have done a tremendous job over the years. And someone asked me before, hey, how is it that you end up doing all these cases? Do you have all these people sending counterfeit drugs to Houston? And it's not for that reason. It's because we have great undercover agents, great agents who have built relationships with you all, and you have felt comfortable contacting them about something that's happening over the internet. And by virtue of the experience that they have developed over the years, they know how to investigate these cases and be successful. So I'm just the beneficiary of what they do. But Mr. Hsu, what the difference with Kevin Hsu was, he's not dealing in simply ED drugs. We're talking about Casodex, Plavix, Prexa. We're talking about blood thinners. We're talking about drugs that really have a clear effect on mainstream citizens. Not someone who sometimes doesn't want to go to the pharmacy. He's using the internet because he's afraid to let everybody know he's using ED drugs. So Mr. Hsu, we found out, was shipping counterfeit Zyprexa, Plavix to UK in barrels marked as chemicals that were never ever touched, because once they had the label that they were compound chemicals, they could reach or be shipped into the UK without inspection. And once they were in the country, they then received this vignette that's necessary to show that they are legitimate to be distributed within the UK. And that's exactly what happened. This slide kind of talks about he was arrested in July of 2007, but this was a long process. We made purchases after purchases after purchases to make sure that what this guy was saying was true, because he gave them I'm not sure if any of you saw the Dan Rather Presents on Kevin Hsu, but there was in the media, there was a long list of types of products that he could provide, and there was no drugs that he said he couldn't provide. He indicated he had contacts with Sanofi Aventis, and he was somehow supplying them with the active ingredients, so we were really concerned when he said that. And he had a pretty extensive operation. I'm just going to go through some of the drugs that, these were all pictures that were obtained from Mr. Hsu's laptop. And what made him such an interesting guy is that he was so calm. There was nothing that concerned him. He said, whatever you need, I can make sure I manufacture, get it to you. It's going to look like the original drug. So he was arrested and prosecuted in 2007 and was convicted. And I think he was sentenced to 78 months back in 2008, and I think that was the most significant sentence for someone trafficking in counterfeit pharmaceuticals at that time. Where are we? Back in the UK? Yes. How'd you get him out of Interesting question. How did he end up coming to the US? He was married, and his wife loved diamonds. And he also was a trade representative for a US company in Florida. So he had a discussion with the undercover agent that his wife liked diamonds. He said, well, heck, Houston has a good market. If you're interested, let us know. So nothing happened, and then 2 months later, the agent received a phone call, says, hey, we're coming to Houston. And I get a phone call saying, look, we don't have to go through, typically, if we're going to engage in arresting someone in a foreign country, we have to go through what's called a LUA process, and that is very cumbersome, very detailed, because you're talking about diplomatic issues. You're talking about a foreign government possibly doing some type of undercover activity in a foreign government. That does not happen without that government's approval and knowledge, and if that happens in China, that's not going to happen unless you have a friendly forum, countries that we have good trade relationships with or good relationships with in the context of law enforcement. That's not going to happen. So when he told us he was coming to China, he's coming to Houston because he wanted to find his wife a diamond, we were ecstatic. So the agent set up this elaborate room where he was told he was going to meet with a doctor who was connected with hospitals, and we were considering mixing and matching the authentic drug with the counterfeit drug. So we have wonderful undercover conversations where he's saying, yeah, those people are going to die anyway, so, who's going to know about it? And once we talked about how he was going to do it, he talked about how he did it in the UK. He talked about the volume, the quantity, quality. He actually had samples with him. And this was a treasure trove of evidence. And here it just fell in our lap. And so at the end of the meeting, the undercover walks out and they come in to arrest him, and he thinks it's a joke. He's like, no, you can cut that out now. I know y'all just kind of tell me how it's going to happen if we can circumvent customs. And they said, no, you're under arrest. The interesting part of that story was that he brought his wife. The wife, of course, was what? Expecting her diamonds. She was also expecting to have lunch with the undercover agent who said his wife knew how to cook noodles. So when they went to the hotel to tell her that her husband's been arrested, the first thing out of her mouth was, I'm not going to get my diamonds or my noodles? But anyway, I'm not sure where I am as far as time, but there are two pressures that deal with keeping our supply chain strong. The pressures from diversion, and the main situation is not going to end. It's not going to end because you have individuals who, I think, have been involved in these type of models in different countries. In 2011, I was part of a panel in Republic of Georgia, and the debate and discussion at that time was parallel imports, where you have the government who has approved manufacturers to market drugs in that country, and then you have the request to bring drugs from outside that country to what? To reduce the price for competition purposes. But they learned that that's not what happened. What happened was that counterfeit pharmaceuticals were being dumped in their country because there's what? No controls. And those companies who could legitimately supply drugs in their own country, there's not enough market to supply their own country and supply other countries. But I see that because of the Prescription Drug Act that was part of the prescription drug coverage that's part of now Medicare, Medicaid, you're going to see the constant assault on legitimate supply chain. We must continue to be vigilant. And if there's anything that I can do for you, I didn't get the end of my slide, which has my contact information, but a number of you who I've dealt with over the years investigating cases know how to contact. But this is not going to end. As they change the mousetrap, we change the mousetrap. It's just a continuous cycle. We must continue to put pressure on counterfeiters and make it more difficult to infiltrate supply chain. Thank you.